Nikki was a seasoned mom with 2 grade school kids. She had stated she had been so young, and it was almost a decade ago when her 2 children were born, that this was to be an exciting new experience for Nikki also, which she was looking forward to. I continued to see my son's goofy grin, ear to ear, endless, as he held his newborn son. He wanted and was a hands-on daddy from the very beginning, and is to this very day. I was there at the house to welcome Triple D home. All 4 generations of the Dietrich family were there: Cowboy Grandpa, Papa, Dada, and Dylan. Nikki and Doug both wanted and felt breastfeeding would be the best method to feed and nurture baby Dylan. And after a short learning curve, Mama and baby fell into a natural, comfortable nursing pattern. This new family was not only thriving, but growing stronger daily. I communicated almost daily with either Doug or Nikki or both. I saw them often after Dylan's birth. I saw them at their worst, and I saw them at their best. Infants are notorious for disrupting the entire family's sleep, and Dylan was no exception. Infants are also demanding on time, which I observed both parents taking responsibility. Nikki was a strong advocate for the family bed concept, so most of the time Dylan nursed and slept with them. Diaper changes were Daddy's area of expertise, and nursings were Mama's. Doug followed Nikki's lead since she was comfortable with her previous parenting knowledge. I was proud of both of them. I did offer advice, try to stop me, but this concept of sound restful sleep would be disturbed other than if baby had his own bed and out of their room. All in all, it was a long, sleepless winter for both. Nikki had wanted both of them to be home together for an extended maternity leave window, so they were together a lot. As the months passed, Dylan was growing into a healthy, happy 6-month-old. He had just started teething and had his first solid taste of solid food, and found, in addition to his mama milk, which we would jokingly always call it liquid gold. As both were getting back into the routine of work, if one was working, the other one was with Dylan. When needed, I was to be the sitter. My husband and I were going to treat to a 6-month baby photo shoot. Nikki did some quick research and decided where, and the date was set. She approached me and asked me if she could have, in addition to the Dylan pictures, if she could have some of just Doug and Dylan together. She wanted to give them to Doug as a surprise Father's Day gift in June. I had just recently purchased a new camera, since I had just celebrated my 2nd grand gift's arrival May 2nd, my first granddaughter. Our family was so excited, for now we had one of each, a little boy and a little girl, only 6 months apart. They would be so close. Let the family fun begin. It was spring. In the month of May. It was our first Mother's Day together. Both my sons and their families were around our dinner table. It was Nikki's first Mother's Day as Dylan's mama. It was mine first as grandma. Everyone was so happy and making plans for summer family activities. That week, we would be doing Dylan's 6-month professional photo shoot, my monthly grand gift photo shoot. This month's theme would have been April showers bring May flowers. In my attempt to take Nikki and Doug's first family photo with the 3 children around my flowering crab tree that should have been in full bloom that next week. These were the times I had dreamed and waited for my family, now grandbabies, and a house full of laughter. I share this with you so you could know my state of mind and how Dylan's parents were feeling, acting, and planning for their future together. At this time, I want to share this photo. It's very special to all of us. It was taken that Mother's Day. It is to be the last family photo that ever exists for Dylan. It's just a simple snapshot. It's not even really in focus, but it's all we have. You may note, when you look at that, Nikki's wearing the same outfit she wore when she was murdered, minus the blood stain. This all happened just days prior to May 21st, 2016, when George S. Burch entered into our lives. Nothing would ever be the same again. For me, Dylan, my son, or my entire family. Why am I qualified to be a voice for Dylan? Let me continue. I was the first person Nikki asked to watch Dylan that night for the concert outing. I had a conflict, so other arrangements had to be made. I felt bad turning them down, since I had been suggesting they both get out, get away from baby, go have some fun, see some friends. Unexpectedly, our descent into hell began. Dylan's daddy notified us, worried that Nikki had not returned home yet from last night's outing. I tried to reassure him that I was sure she was probably just still sleeping somewhere at a friend's home and would be home soon. He needed us to come, so we drove over. I heard and witnessed the concern. I was there when he called the police and reported Nikki missing. I was there holding Dylan when police arrived to take the report. I was there to take care of Dylan when police asked Doug to come to the police station. I was there to pack up Dylan in the middle of the night when police said we could go pick up Doug. I was there to witness my son's anguish as he came out from that station because they had told him they thought it was her body. I was there to cry. I was there to weep. It just couldn't be true. We didn't want to believe it. I tried to comfort Dylan after a bottle. Nothing worked. It was as if Dylan knew Mama was gone. The only thing that would comfort Dylan was lying on his daddy's chest, which he had done so many times before that night. I continued to listen to my son's endless sobbing as Dylan laid on his chest. Why, what had happened to Nikki? I was there to start weaning Dylan from his mother's breast milk, since there would be no more. I was there when the police came to my door to arrest my son. My head was spinning. My heart was aching for Nikki and now Doug, both gone. What was going on? Dylan now had no mama or daddy. To say I was confused is putting it mild. I was horrified, afraid, numb, and in pain. I felt helpless. I experienced panic attacks. I experienced anxiety attacks. I was frustrated, afraid to trust. I could not sleep. I would have nightmares, wake up sweating. I couldn't breathe. I wouldn't attend outings that I would have loved to attend. I lost interest in things I loved doing. I was depressed. I had to make myself get out of bed. I would avoid friends and family. I cried all the time. I had unreasonable fears. I couldn't stop thinking about Nikki, what was done to her, Doug, Dylan, and her other two children. I wondered, what if I had babysat that night? Would the outcome have been different? Would my son, would his son, would all of us still have Nikki? To this very day, tears come very easily when I go to my front door. I relive the arrest. To this very day, tears come when I pass the rape and death site in a family-oriented neighborhood that Nikki and Doug loved and felt safe to raise their kids. To this day, I can't use that on-ramp without thinking about Burch's actions. I have a hard time driving on Hoffman Road, the site where Burch threw Nikki away like she didn't even matter. She did matter. We loved her and we miss her. Dylan will never remember those first months he had a mother. Dylan will never get to hear her laugh or experience that big smile. Dylan will never get to hear her say, "I love you" to the moon and back. Dylan will never remember how she always combed through that round then fuzzy head of hair each time she left him. Dylan will never have the opportunity to hear her advice or have her guidance. Gone forever are the opportunities for memories of holidays, birthdays, vacations, proms, weddings, even a chance for Nikki to experience the joy of becoming a grandmother herself years from now. Burch tried to take Dylan's mother and father's reputation with no respect for her children. Dylan will never have a childhood like the one you described yourself as having. Burch robbed Dylan of all this and more. Think about all the children his actions have damaged. He knew she had children. He just didn't care. Yes, Nikki's own 3, a niece, a nephew, the 2 boys who found her body, children in the neighborhood and surrounding areas. What about your own kids? He has no conscience, no soul. He shows no remorse. He should be made accountable for all the emotional injuries. This crime has made me question my faith. Being Catholic, I was taught not to hate and to forgive. I believe I'm experiencing hate for the first time and I don't like it. As far as forgiveness, I don't know if I'll ever get there. We have all been violated. We have had our privacy taken. Vicky has had to bury a child due to Burch's sick, perverted, and violent actions. This was no accident. He is a predator, plain and simple. He has no human-worthy qualities. I would call him an animal, but I would be insulting the animal kingdom. We have had our lives disrupted, damaged, and changed. We respond to life differently now, and not always for the best. He has left his bloody mark on the entire community as well. It was torture to listen to his volumes of lies, fiction, sex. I knew her well enough, and believe me, she would have wanted me to tell you she didn't want sex from him. Oh, wait. I think she did tell us that herself with the number and type of injuries he gave her. 41? No. 141? No. 241 if I remember correctly. The reality was she must have found him so disgusting she would have rather taken a beating from him than to have sex with him. Rape is not about sex. It's a violent act of hatred and power. This crime shows his inadequacies as a real man. He's a male, not a man. Pleasuring her? You made me sick. I doubt he's even able to sexually perform if the female isn't drunk, drugged, or unconscious. Breathing wasn't even required. But in the end, the truth and the facts won. Facts don't lie. We had Nikki on our side, guiding and leaving the breadcrumbs right to him. She was determined not to let him get away with this. She fought him hard alive and in death. Mr. Burch didn't just kill Nikki, he destroyed a young family with so many hopes and dreams of others. I'm a part of Dylan's daily care and will be for my entire life. I am sure I'll be a part of the delicate explaining and emotional support when the time comes when Dylan asks Daddy why he doesn't have a mommy here and why she's in heaven, with the explanations getting more detailed over time as he grows up. And the reality and the pain will again surface and make a new wound. So many innocent lives changed forever. I ask you today to please give an innocent little boy and myself, as well as others, the peace of mind and the physical security that Mr. Burch never gets the opportunity to experience any free life he would have remaining after serving time. Punish him with the harshest sentence, life with no parole. And note, if he ever is given parole, we will be there at each and every hearing, whatever it takes to block that. He will kill again if given opportunity. He did this crime way too easy. And he went fishing later that day, like nothing ever happened. Oh yeah, I remember it was pre-planned. I want Mr. Burch to know that I too enjoy fishing. And each time I'm there on the water, with the sun on my face and the wind in my hair, I'm going to think of you, and I'm going to smile, just knowing you can't fish anymore. It's a little thing, but it does pleasure me in knowing that. One last consideration. Please don't allow him to gain anything financially in any way from this crime. The sheer brutality and disregard for human life in this crime is unthinkable. All Nikki wanted from him was a ride home. A ride home. Back to Doug, back to her baby. In closing, please go home today. Hug your loved ones. Tell them you love them. Show them you love them. I'm still discovering the effects of this crime, not only with myself, but through the observation of family members. I felt my family and I were dropped into hell from this crime. I am walking back. Some days I make more distance than others. It's a long, long way to walk back. You know, I got thinking, I don't know if you were ever properly welcomed here to Wisconsin the way you came here and all picking up your skirt and running scared here from Virginia. Welcome. I hope you enjoy your life sentence in one of our Wisconsin prisons. I do want to thank the DA's office, the Brown County Sheriff's Department, the Green Bay Police Department for all their dedication and hard work. Also a special thanks for your Victims Advocate Department, from Karen, who was here at the very beginning and ended up helping from afar, to Kim at my side today and all the others involved. To the court, thank you. I'm not going to pretend that I understand or even like some of the things that you put us all through, but I guess it works. Thank you for allowing me this time.
And Mrs. Dietrich, for the record, your first name again.
Oh, I'm sorry,
That's
Diane.
Diane.
D-I-A-N-E.
Thank you, Diane.
And Dylan is D-Y-L-A-N.
Thank you, Diane. Kim, can I have that photograph, please?
Your Honor, I'm reading a statement on behalf of Douglas Dietrich.
All right, go ahead.
The past 2 years have been nothing short of torture for me and my family. On May 21st, I dread that day. It gives me so much anxiety knowing the pain that telling him will cause. I will have to explain how a person can be capable of so much evil and so much anger that they feel it is their right to take away another person's life. I fear and know that me telling him will steal away his innocence. He will unfortunately figure out at a young age that there are people that are truly evil in this world. Ones that can and will take someone's life without thinking twice about it. I will have to explain that George Burch took away Mommy's life before he could even get a chance to know her. Besides the stories our family tells him, the only way Dylan will learn what his mommy was like will be from the media coverage and gossip surrounding this case. George Burch took the stand and said truly awful and untrue things about his mommy and daddy, and Dylan will most likely see the testimony at some point in his life. I will not only have to live with the fact that Dylan will know his mommy's life was cut short in such an awful and brutal way, but he will also find out that his daddy was first blamed for those terrible acts. I fear this could be too much for him to handle, and I'm very concerned about the damage that George Burch's heinous acts will continue to have on me and my family in the future. I know that it will have a lifelong consequence for Dylan and me. Green Bay is a small community, and I am certain that most people here have opinions about this case, about Nikki, me, and our families. I'm also certain that many misstatements have been said and spread throughout the town. The massive amount of local and national media attention has created a giant spotlight on every single thing any of us do. Both personally and professionally, I worry that others have and will treat us differently because of what Mr. Burch did. As you know, I was originally arrested in connection with Nikki's brutal murder. I had to process the fact that the love of my life had been killed in cold blood while others pointed the finger at me. The real killer, George Burch, knew that I had been arrested. He decided that making me feel the loss of Nikki wasn't enough, but that I should have to endure false accusations, arrest, and mass amounts of public scrutiny. He decided to make my family suffer even more when they tried desperately to prove my innocence. After I was vindicated and George Burch was eventually arrested, he still wasn't done inflicting pain on my family. He decided to continue with a false story. He decided to try again to point the finger at me. He decided he did not want to take responsibility for his terrible acts and put me, my family, and Nikki's family through hell again. I'm so thankful that I had a guardian angel, Nikki, protecting me when I was testifying and being blamed by George Burch for her murder. I am convinced that she was watching over Dylan, me, her family, and my family throughout this process. I know she helped to make sure that justice was done. George Burch's false accusations have affected me in very deep and real ways. I still vividly remember sitting in a jail cell while Nikki's funeral was taking place. I couldn't say my last goodbyes. I couldn't grieve with Nikki and my family. I couldn't be there for Dylan, Nikki's family, or my family. I was stuck in jail being accused of a horrific crime I didn't commit. When I was finally released, I had to endure that damage that my arrest and false accusations caused between me and Nikki's family. I had to rebuild trust and was put in the position of having people close to me question my involvement. I'm thankful that Brown County law enforcement followed the evidence and arrested the real killer, George Burch. The pain and suffering I went through is nothing compared to the pain and suffering Nikki endured. George Burch brutally raped and murdered Nikki while our son Dylan and I slept. He then discarded her in a field, threw her blood-soaked clothes on the side of the road, and went on a fishing trip that very same morning. George Burch is a monster. He should rot in prison for the rest of his life. He has proven that he does not deserve the privilege of being free ever again. He is a danger to society. The way in which he took Nikki's life and then left her in a field and then go on with his life shows his true character. George Burch not only took Nikki's life in a brutal fashion, but he then concocted a story to try and get out of taking responsibility for his actions. The fact that he would say that Nikki was consensually having sex with him in the neighborhood we live in is disgusting and shows a complete disregard for her. He also tried to blame me for Nikki's death. I'm thankful that the jury rejected his lies. The damage this has done to me and my family and Nikki's family is tremendous. This will always be something that we have to deal with, and the pain that Burch caused will never go away. The past 2 years I have been living in hell. I have processed a range of emotions: hopelessness, disgust, isolation, devastation, and depression. I felt anxious, lost, and a long for Nikki's touch, her comfort, help, and presence. So has our son Dylan. George Burch brutally stole that from me, and he took so much more that night. Not only has this been an unimaginable nightmare, but it's a recurring one. I know the consequences of George Burch's actions will have lifelong consequences for all involved. And now the court should impose a lifelong sanction on George Burch, with no opportunity for release, ever. On behalf of myself, Dylan, and Nikki, I ask that you impose the maximum sentence of life in prison. For murdering Nikki in cold blood, putting our families and the community through a lengthy trial, George Burch has shown absolutely no remorse for the things he did. George Burch hid behind his lies. He is nothing but a coward. Your Honor, I ask the court to give George Burch the same amount of mercy he allowed Nikki. None. Please sentence him to prison for life without any chance of release. I never want my son to have to fear seeing his mommy's murderer roaming the streets free.
And that was Mr. Dietry's victim impact statement.
Yes, Your Honor.
Anybody else wish to address the court?
No, Your Honor. Nothing to state.
Anybody from the defense, Attorney Cano?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Parties ready to present their sentencing statements?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Attorney Saunders, go ahead on behalf of the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. Obviously, we're here today for what's probably legally and morally the most significant thing another person can do to another human being. Especially, as the court knows, when it was done in the degree of depravity and heinousness that was exhibited in this case. And I want to thank the family for speaking here today. Quite honestly, they articulated the effect that this crime had on them better than I ever can. And I know it's been a long 2 years. They've come to every hearing, every meeting in our office. And I think the support that he has is just a testament to who she was as a person. And by all accounts, she was nothing but a positive and a benefit to our community. The defendant stands convicted of a first-degree intentional homicide. And it's a crime the legislature, rightfully so, has deemed worthy of the courts sentencing the defendant to life without the possibility of parole. That is the recommendation of the PSI writer makes in this case, and that is a recommendation that the state believes is wholly appropriate when you consider all of the sentencing factors. Now, I don't think it's necessary or in all candor, the state doesn't desire to get into all the facts that happened in this case. The court is well aware of the level of brutality and barbaric acts that have been exhibited in this case. He was left with 241 injuries. There were indications of strangulation, of sexual assault, to the point where, unfortunately, the law enforcement needed to use dental evidence to identify her. Clearly, the acts themselves exhibit a level of depravity that I think makes this a truly aggravated case, and a case that we don't see very often in this community. Again, I think it's important to remember this isn't a case where the victim and the defendant knew each other, where there was alcohol involved, and there was an argument that preceded it. This was a random attack on, in this case, an extremely vulnerable victim. Somebody who was walking home, trying to get home to her 6-month-old child and her boyfriend. And she, unfortunately, put the trust into the wrong George Burch. And Mr. Burch completely and wholly abused that trust. When he didn't get his way that night, he decided to brutally murder her in the street, right in the middle of Ledgeview. And I understand the defendant has a right to testify to the version of events that he wants to testify to, and that's a right that he exercised. But I think it's a version that the jury, rightfully so, found to be wholly incredible and at odds with every other piece of evidence in this case. And the fact that he got up there and testified to that version in front of the victim's family, her loved ones, her friends, not more than 30 feet away, he's testifying to acts which have no basis in reality. I think that speaks very highly, or speaks very poorly rather, of his character. It not only served to present a version of events that just plainly did not happen, it also served to re-victimize not only Nikki, but her entire family. Putting them through that, listening for 4 or 5 hours of his testimony, listening to the acts which he described Nikki having engaged in, it clearly makes this an aggravated case. And I think the court is well aware of that. I know the court is to consider the character of the defendant. And quite honestly, I think that's pretty hard to assess in this case. There wasn't any participation in the pre-sentence report, and we really don't know a lot about the defendant's insight into this offense, or if there's been any level of remorse since the incident. And I would submit that there really hasn't been much of any remorse, any acknowledgement of what he did in this case. And that's since the date of the conviction. Now, at trial, if the court's familiar, we did present the photograph of conviction, and other individuals have testified or talked about that photograph as well. And I think that is the most indicative thing the court can look at to see the defendant's level of remorse in this case. That was the same day, within hours of this brutal act, and the defendant is fishing. It's a sunny day. He is smiling, not a care in the world, with a smug grin on his face, here to Virginia, for the same day, within hours of doing this. I think that speaks the loudest as to who Mr. Burch is as a person. It shows the court he is the type of person who can do what he did to Nikki and not have care within hours after the fact. Now, clearly, the PSI writer has detailed Mr. Burch's prior convictions, and they are significant convictions, I would characterize, and they go back really since he became an adult. And there were juvenile adjudications as well. But particularly, there are criminal convictions which I think shed a light on his character. There are destruction of private property, burglary convictions, grand larceny, the offense for which he was absconded from probation when he was here in May. There are drug convictions, possession of intent to distribute marijuana, possession of marijuana. There's a pending possession of heroin case in Virginia. And there's also a conviction for possession of firearm by a convicted felon. So these are offenses that bear extremely poorly on the character. And I think the court must consider that in assessing the totality of who Mr. Burch is as a person. And I think considering particularly the acts in this case, the defendant's prior record, the minimal amount of remorse or acknowledgement of his own actions in this case, is precisely why the court must protect the public from Mr. Burch in the future. Now, there could have really been anyone who walked into that bar in Richard Cranium's on May 20th and May 21st. It happened to be Nikki in this case. But the level of depravity and the actions of the defendant could have been anyone in this community. And again, this is not the level of violence that we typically see here in Brown County. Certainly not any time recently. And in that sense, really, another victim of this crime. Obviously, Nikki and the family are the most impacted by this. But in a way, the community as a whole has been victimized by Mr. Burch's actions. Again, this is a person who really shouldn't be living in Wisconsin or in Brown County at this time. He was absconding from supervision at the time. And with all due respect to other homicides that we see, clearly there are other forms of intentional homicide that are equally serious. But you think of shooting deaths, think of interactions between those who are in a relationship, and there's an argument and something happens. I think this level of intentional act towards a random citizen in Brown County, an individual who shouldn't even be in Brown County, makes this a particularly aggravated case. And it's a case that deserves a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. In this case, you have not the simple, we're not trying to diminish shooting deaths. You don't have one single act of pulling a trigger and killing another person. You have 241 injuries. You have beatings, you have stompings, you have strangulation, ligature. Each act, an individual act, with the intent and the will and the desire to see Nikki die that night. Each individual act in and of itself an intentional act. And I think that's exactly the type of loss of control, of rage, of vengeance that the community needs to be protected from. And I also think proper consideration for the courts is deterrence. There needs to be an understanding in this community, and I think it's an understanding that most people in this community have, that if an individual engages in this level of heinous act towards another person, that there isn't going to be a question of what the consequence would be. This is an act that the legislature has deemed worthy of the court imposing a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And if this level of gravity is not case worthy of that, I don't know what case would have to be before the court for the court to issue a life sentence without parole. This is precisely the type of conduct the public expects that they are protected from. The only way to accomplish that is to ensure that Mr. Burch does not ever in the future come released into the community again. I think on understanding the factors the court is to consider, the seriousness of the offense, the character of the defendant, the need to protect the public, punishment to the defendant, deterrence, I think that all those factors should conclusively demonstrate to the court that it is wholly inappropriate for the defendant to be released back into our community, into any community in the future. For that reason, the state is joining in the recommendation of the Department of Corrections in this case. We would ask that the court impose a life sentence without the possibility of the defendant in the future requesting to be released on to extended supervision. And there are some, obviously, if there are any conditions of extended supervision or release in the future, such as restitution, we are asking for 60 days to get all those figures together for the court.
All right, thank you, Attorney Saunders. Attorney Cano, or whoever's going to make the argument for the defense, go ahead.
Thank you, Joe. Your Honor, you heard a trial here. The result of that was the death of a human being. It's understandably a very emotional place that we're at right now. The media's here, the public's here, and the death of a human being, by its very nature, is very serious. Ms. Vander Heiden, as testified to here today by family members, was loved, and her loss will be missed by her family members. We're here for legal proceedings and the legal process where we're sentencing Mr. Burch, and that's the function of the trial court. And the state rightly indicated that there are some functions that in some case law that we have to look at, and the rehabilitation of the offender is one of the factors that the court can and must consider. It's for those reasons that we're asking the court to consider the possibility of parole. There's going to be lifelong sanctions for this, however the court sentences Mr. Burch. But we're asking the court to consider make him eligible for parole within 25 to 30 years. Now, the court has heard the trial, has heard a lot of noise, a lot of media coverage. The court received a lot of letters. Some of those letters, I don't know whether they qualify under the victim statute. Some of the letters, I can't tell where they come from. But I do know that some of them appear to be from another state in which he was arrested and charged with a crime and was acquitted. And with all due respect to that jury, I would ask that the court afford those letters a proper weight. It appears that Mr. Burch was a victim in that matter, and so I would ask the court to afford it as a proper weight. I understand that the state is asking for 60 days to receive the restitution issues, and that we were going to ask for a hearing based on the limited information we received from the pre-sentence investigation. Some of them appears reasonable and rightful for the family, but some of it does not appear to fall under the statutes. And we have no paperwork to really look into that, so that is an issue that will probably come up before Your Honor. The court heard the trial. The court heard about Mr. Burch. The court heard that he was born in 78, that he grew up in Virginia. His parents divorced at a young age. He comes from a religious background. It appears that his family were hardworking. It appears that Mr. Burch enjoyed sports. He was hardworking himself. And grew up a life where he did have some entanglements with the law. In '98, a local gang leader appears, from what I understand from the limited facts, attacked him, and he defended himself and was acquitted in the trial there. Shortly after that, Mr. Burch moved to New York. He was married in 2001. He now has 3 children. He has 2 boys and a daughter. The court is aware of his prior criminal history. Of note, there's not a violence in that history. There's drug-type charges. There's felony status type cases and traffic type cases. But there is no history of violence. What we do know, and what the pre-sentence investigator was able to ascertain, is that there may be AUDA issues. And I think that's something the court can consider. There's certainly drug issues, and one can read that from his prior criminal history. And it looks like at one time he was taking medication. It looked like for ADHD. But he's no longer taking those, but I think that's an issue that the court can look at. Those are all issues that the court can consider when sentencing Mr. Burch. Your Honor, this is a highly emotional case. The repercussions were life-changing. They're going to have lifetime impact on all the parties involved. I know, and the court is aware, that things change, that people change, that circumstances change. We're unable to read the future. There are rehabilitative needs that everybody, I think, can acknowledge is a factor here. We know, because even if the possibility of parole is given, that if the circumstances meet it, that Mr. Burch is set free. If they're not, and then they're not. And all parties are aware or given dates as to when those hearings are held. My point is, we're here at a legal proceeding today. Emotions are high. Repercussions. The death of a human being is to be considered here. But I do know that there are people change, circumstances change, and I'm going to ask the court to consider those factors when in sentencing Mr. Burch. The court heard the trial. There's technology issues that came in here. I think the media became involved because of Fitbit. That's an issue that we don't know where it's going to go. There was an issue of Mr. Dietrich. There's pending charges, and there's a death of a human being. There's so much here, so many issues. There's rehabilitative issues. There's AODA issues, drug issues, ADHD. We're going to ask the court to take that all into account. We do think that that there's going to be a lifetime sanction there. The nature of the charge, what the jury found, obligates us to make it a lifetime issue. We're going to ask that within 25 to 30 years that the court grant Mr. Burch the ability to request parole. And Judge, this wasn't said earlier, but it is a factor or something the court should know. He's been in custody, including today, 605 days, yesterday, 604.
Anything else, Attorney Cano?
Judge, the court has heard the trial, heard all the evidence. The court is aware of the motions that were brought, and so at this time we would leave it in the court's hand.
All right. Mr. Burch, you have the absolute right at this time to address the court and tell me anything on your heart and mind at this time. Is there anything you want to tell me this afternoon?
No, sir, Your Honor.
Mr. Burch. Number of lives affected by Mr. Burch have a lifelong effect on so many people. When I think about the fact that George Burch came to Wisconsin and in less than 6 months left a trail of death and destruction, it is unacceptable. What chance did he give Nikki? The scars that have been inflicted run very deep. This monster Burch doesn't deserve to live, let alone be eligible for parole. Dylan will never know who his mother was. Doug Dietrich not only lost the mother of his child, but was put through hell during the whole process. Doug was arrested for something he had nothing to do with. These families have gone through hell and back many, many times. A good, upstanding family in the community has been dragged through the depths of hell. Nikki won't get a second chance. Why should he? Mr. Burch can't come into our community and so senselessly rape and murder my friend and think he can get away with it. He concocted a ridiculous story where he's the victim, to put the blame on someone else. I received a second set of letters talking about Nikki and how she made life fun, gave happiness everywhere she went. Because of what Mr. Burch did, our family will never be the same. Sickened me to have Mr. Burch tell his lies in front of families, the court, and the rest of the world, and how Nikki wanted it. There's a letter here that says, Nikki showed me how to be an amazing parent, how to keep smiling even through hard times. We've all lost a place or a piece of our hearts that we will never get back. Nikki was a strong, smart, interesting person, and she had a tremendous amount of patience. The court has reviewed all of those letters. All of those letters are written on behalf of Nicole Vanderheiden. I didn't receive any letters on behalf of Mr. Burch, which in some ways is sad and maybe telling. Of course, it doesn't matter how many letters the court receives on one side or the other. You know, I'm looking at this photo here. This is a beautiful photo of Nicole, Mr. Dietrich, and Dylan. And how many photos are like this in our community? You know, thousands. We have thousands of families like this. And this family is destroyed. It's ruined. It'll never be like this again. And as I was thinking about today's sentencing, it's a powerful memory to know how, like, one decision, one fateful decision can change your life forever. It might be your decision which way you decide to go home from work one day. It might be someone else's decision, like, what if Mr. Burch had decided to stay in Virginia? It's also a reminder of just how one person can change people's lives forever for the worse and ruin a whole family's life. It could be a drug dealer, it could be a drunk driver, or it could be a murderer, or as the family would say, a monster. And now we have sentencing today. We had a long trial. It was difficult for everybody. And this is the part of the system where we have sentencing. What the court wishes it had was a magic wand. What the court wishes it had was a time machine. If we had the perfect world, we just wave that wand and we turn the clock back to May 20th, of 2016. And Nicole would be returned to her family, and we'd happily send Mr. Burch back to Virginia. That's what I wish we could do, but we don't live in that perfect world. We live in the real world. And we live in the confines of an oftentimes imperfect justice system, and we do the best we can. So we have a sentencing today. And Attorney Kondo is right. There's a lot of emotion here. But just like the jury is instructed in the burden of proof instruction, you are not to make your decision based upon emotion or sympathy. A judge is not to make a sentencing decision on emotion. You have to somehow take a step back and dispassionately review the facts of the case and apply it to the sentencing factors and come up with a fair and rational sentence. So that's what the court's attempting to do. And we have to make a record today. So I ask people to indulge the court as I make that record in terms of how the court's arrived to its sentencing, including those factors. And those factors were enumerated in a case, State versus Gallion, 285 West 2nd 473. It's a Court of Appeals case. So whenever, in any case, the court has to look at the severity of the offense, the character of the defendant, and the need to protect the public. And there are other decisions that talk about other goals of the criminal justice system at sentencing, rehabilitation of the defendant. Attorney Kondo talked about that. Protection of the public, deterrence, Attorney Saunders talked about that, and punishment. Those are all goals and laudable goals of the criminal justice system. We've had a full and fair trial. Mr. Burch received a full and fair trial. People probably know more about this case than 99% of the other cases that come through the criminal justice system. And again, the court has to make its record today. A sentence isn't as simple as just lock the door and throw away the key, and we don't live in a society where it's an eye for an eye. As much as that might seem tempting. So we have to go through these factors, these sentencing factors. First of all, Mr. Burch has been convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. And Attorney Kondo's right. There are a lot of issues surrounding this case, a lot of technology issues involving Mr. Dietrich, but just for the record, Mr. Burch is guilty of this offense, pure and simple. The court heard all the evidence. The jury found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, and quite frankly, Mr. Burch's story made no sense. He's guilty. Nobody should have any doubt about that. So we have to talk about the severity of this offense. And I apologize to the family, but I have to make my record here. We have to talk about what a violent crime this was. I'm just going to refer to the pre-sentence investigation. The family's been traumatized numerous times, and it's going to hurt one more time. But Nicole suffered significant blunt force trauma to the left side of her face, skull fracture, broken jaw, ligature marks around her neck, numerous internal injuries, esophagus, trachea, the neck. She died from blunt force trauma to her head and from strangulation. And she was transported to a field after being killed. And what really struck me when I heard all of this evidence, and it was 241 separate injuries, I heard that distinctly, but also where her body was found, and she had her one arm on top of another, and there was blood splatter over the rest of her body. I mean, what had happened was that she was already dead or dying, and Mr. Burch either stomped on her head or kicked her in the head. That kind of brutality is frightening. It's really incomprehensible. How angry do you have to be to do something like that? That's what the physical evidence demonstrated. Now, I've grown up in this community, and I've been here in the criminal justice system for 31 years. And I've seen a lot of pain and a lot of terrible cases, and we're not going to go through those, but one case involved someone who was beaten badly in a paper mill and thrown into a vat. A terrible death. I also had another trial where somebody was accosted in a bar by a group of bikers and suffered tremendous injury and was abused and had her throat slit. Those were terrible crimes. One crime I can remember, there were 13 areas of bruising on his body, and there were 89 separate areas of injury on her body. This case is 241 different areas. And the other thing is, that VAT case and that biker case, those terrible violent crimes were committed by a group of individuals. They were committed by the mentality of the mob, where people just got wound up more and more and got more and more violent. But Nicole suffered her injuries at the hands of one person, Mr. Burch. So I think it's accurate to say that this was the most brutal murder. This is the most brutal murder that has ever been committed by one person in the history of Brown County. That's how severe this case is. She refused to have sex. The witnesses are right. And then when Mr. Burch got physical, she resisted and she fought. And as the family said in some correspondence, she said no, fought back, and was killed because she was exercising her right to say no. And she did suffer. It's not a bullet through the head and it's instantaneous death. She suffered. And she must have been greatly frightened those last few moments of her life, thinking, how can this be happening to me? All I want to do is go home to my son. That's all I wanted to do. That's how severe this case is. And then, in terms of severity, the impact on the family, we've heard of that. It would be a severe case even if this was somebody from St. John the Evangelist homeless shelter who didn't have the kind of loving families that Nicole had. But what about the impact on Nicole and on the families? In terms of Nicole, we've heard about Nicole. And it's important for the community to know about Nicole, about this person who was a teacher, one of the most honorable professions there is, who was a teacher because she enjoyed seeing kids learn things. And the court can see in photos and has heard that she was almost always smiling. What a beautiful attribute that is. I'm sure she was someone who would light up a room. We can all think of people who never smiled. She was a smiler. She was a volunteer. She was a good person, but most importantly, she was very good at the most important job any of us can ever have, and that's being a parent. She was a parent to 3 beautiful children, including little Dylan. She was a loving and active mother. We heard about that today. And her children, Michaela, Tyler, and Dylan. So Nicole was the immediate victim, but then look at what it's done to the families. Look what it's done to her parents. You know, a parent should never have to bury a child. Sometimes it happens, but never should they ever have to do that under these circumstances? And then the residuals that flowed from this terrible act. It's like you said, she doesn't even get to see her grandkids as much. That's a direct result of Mr. Burch's actions. And grandparents are an extremely important, they're extremely important people in every child's life, and that's been compromised for the kids because of what Mr. Burch did. The father says that his daughter's murder is constantly on his brain. I have no doubt of that. The mother, her heart aches every day. Today she said, we are shells of what we used to be. He's taken so much away from us. I know people who have lost children to natural causes. They say they're never the same. It's never the same. Well, it's never the same here. And under a brutal murder like this, that's the impact, Mr. Burch, that you've had on the lives of the family. The sister, you took away her best friend, as sisters should be. She'll never be the same. She's indicated at times she's not even able to breathe because there is just so much pain. The children, her children, Tyler, hurting and acting out. It's not surprising he's lost his mother. And Michaela, who's hurting and longing for her mother, like any daughter would. And then little Dylan, who will never remember his mother, will never have all of those moments with his mother. And as Mr. Dietrich says, it's going to be very difficult to talk to him about what happened and why, where's mom? Why isn't my mom here? I have seen a child of one of those murder victims in court a number of times. They have struggled their entire life because their parent was brutally taken away from them. And my prayer is that these children don't suffer that fate, that they are strong. I trust they'll be survivors because they have two good families who are supporting them and will take care of them. And of course, Nicole has had many friends and acquaintances who have suffered a great loss. And it's true. The community suffers as well. There was an old saying that I remember when I was growing up, when one member of the community suffers, we all suffer. Even if we're not that conscious of it, especially under these circumstances. And of course, there's Mr. Dietrich. He's certainly a victim here as well. He comes from a very nice family. We've heard these letters about compounding the trauma by having to be put through the ringer of a trial like this. First being accused as her killer. You took away the mother of his child, Mr. Burch. That's a terrible, terrible crime. And now he's got to step up. He's the parent in the child's life. And I pray for Mr. Dietrich as well. You better clean up the drugs in his house. I heard about that during the trial. He's got to be a role model now to his son. He's going to need the support and help of the families as well. The fact that he couldn't be at Nicole's funeral is totally unfair. He has a pain that will never go away. Mr. Dietrich has been victimized in many ways in this case. So, if you look at the brutality of this case and the number of victims, look how severe this case is. That is an extremely severe crime. It's a factor that the court has to consider. The second factor is protection of the public. And this is very important. I think we all kind of take our safety for granted, don't we? We never really think about it until something happens. Years ago, we could walk down the street in Green Bay and you never thought twice about it. I'd go up to Colburn Park, I'd walk home, Couldn't do that anymore now, by yourself. We live in a different world. Growing up in this community, who could have ever thought we'd have a case like this? A random act of violence like this. It's like Heather said, she didn't think anything like this would happen in this area to a nice person. It's beautifully said. It's a random act of violence. It's like Attorney Saunders said, a lot of times we have people who are in a relationship, we have people who are involved in drug dealing and there's violence. This is someone who was just minding her own business and trying to get home. It could have been any number of people. And that should be and is extremely unsettling to this community. And let there be no doubt here, she was walking home. Now, Mr. Burch, during the trial, said, well, she came to Richard Cranium's bar where I had all these friends and everybody kind of knew me. And, you know, Mr. Burch, if that really happened, there would have been a witness on that stand, probably more than one that would have came into this courtroom and said, yeah, big country, he was having a good old time in that bar. We didn't hear that, Mr. Burch, because it never happened. What happened is what you told those inmates in the jail. You picked her up. She was walking on the street and you picked her up. She got into your car because she needed a ride. She wanted to get home. And maybe at that point, she wasn't really keen on seeing Mr. Dietrich, but she wanted to get home to Dylan. She wanted to get home to her 6-month-old son. A simple request, and it cost her her life because of what you did. Protection of the public is extremely important in this case as well. And then there's the character of the defendant. That's the other factor that the court has to look at. You know, I read those letters, Mr. Burch. It said there's no good in you. And we've heard that you're a monster. You know, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, Mr. Burch, in the sense that, you know, there's good in everybody, isn't there? Nicole was a Christian, Community Fellowship Church. She'd probably agree, because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. So somehow, there's good somewhere in you, Mr. Burch. There is. Or there was. You know, we're all born, we're all little babies. Like Dylan? You were like that one day, Mr. Burch, and then we all go down these different roads of life based upon what experiences we have, and how did we end up here? How did you end up here? How did all this pain get inflicted on so many people? You were adopted, and you were close to your dad, and your parents divorced, and it bothered you greatly, just like so many other kids are bothered when their parents are divorced. It's very human. And you were involved in sports, football, basketball, baseball, wrestling. You were human. There was some good there. But then it's hard to wrap that concept around when you could brutally murder this woman, drop the body off in a field, and then 12 hours later go on a boat and be smiling like nothing happened. Like you didn't have a care in the world. How can we explain that? That isn't human. That is not normal. But we saw it. That's the fact. Those are facts. Your record is a factor that the court has to look at. It's been addressed by both parties. Maybe it didn't have the violence that violent offenses, but there was a threat to burn a home, curse and abuse. I don't know what that is in Virginia. Destruction of private property, possession of firearm by a convicted felon, possession of marijuana, OWI, possession with intent to distribute marijuana, driving under the influence, grand larceny. And we heard somewhat about that murder out in Virginia, or that homicide case. And Mr. Burch, you're not being sentenced because of that, because you were acquitted. I don't know what the facts of that case is. Joey White, I've heard nothing but good things about him, although I remember when I saw that paper on the screen, it talked about him being a gang leader or a gang member, but who knows what the facts are. Maybe the jury made the correct legal verdict there. The fact is, it was still violent. We're still involved in violence. You're not being sentenced on that case. You're being sentenced on what you did to Nicole Vanderheiden. There are 2 outstanding warrants. There's a pending possession of heroin charge, and then there's the probation violation while you're on paper for grand larceny. There was information in the PSI from your wife. You're still legally married to Mary Burch. You married her in 2001, Mr. Burch. And she left you because of your drug use. Now, maybe there was drug use that night. Maybe that might explain how such brutality could take place to Nicole. Pot, heroin, pills, whatever else. She said you do have an anger problem. You'd get upset very easily. I heard about it in one of those pretrial motions. She said you couldn't keep your job. That you could work, you didn't keep jobs, and that was kind of similar to what happened here in Brown County. It's interesting, she said she never really got to know the real George Burch. She described you, and I don't think this is insignificant, Mr. Burch. She described you as someone who had people who at one time loved you, but over time you lost them because of your behavior. Look at the Jacksons. Ed and Linda, they befriended you. They got you a job. They got you a car. They gave you a roof over your head. They gave you a phone. And yet, within a period of months, that relationship disintegrated. Not because of them. It was your behavior. And as was pointed out, you have children as well. Daughter with Elisa Lombardo, whereabouts unknown, we never heard about her. But you have 2 sons. One of them, you have a Tyler too. Tyler, 16 years old. And a son named Colin, age 13. Now Tyler doesn't want, apparently, to have anything to do with you at this point. I don't know if he knows about the case. It may have been that you just up and left without giving them any notice. You also have your son Colin, who still loves you, wants to see you. Kind of reminds me of the Maloney case. So you have 2 sons. You know, they're victims too. They're victims. They've been harmed by your conduct here. Colin is never going to see you outside the confines of prison, and maybe Tyler will come around, but he's never going to have that opportunity either. Now, every pre-sentence report talks about remorse or lack of it. Every PSI talks about accepting responsibility. I can't find that here. It doesn't exist in this PSI. I don't know if it's there or not. I do want to comment, though, about the trial. The court is not punishing you, Mr. Burch, because you exercised your constitutional right to a trial. Every defendant has that. But the evidence was overwhelming. The technological evidence, even without Fitbit, was overwhelming. Just the DNA. Your DNA is all over this woman's body, and where's Dietrich's DNA? Dietrich had no DNA on her body, or hardly any. The cell phone GPS tracking. And so, the family had to undergo that grueling trial and hear everything that happened. You know, just a thought, Mr. Burch. He said yes, sir, and no, sir. The manly thing would have been to say, I did it, I flipped out, I did whatever. Cop will plead, do something, and step up to the plate, and you chose not to do that. You still haven't done that. And part of that maybe is self-preservation, try to get out of it. Maybe, just maybe it's because even you know how awful a crime this is, and you can't come to grips with admitting what you did, and that you are responsible for what you did to Nicole Vanderheiden. But what complicates things, though, is not only did you just brutally murder her, but you took away her life, and then you kind of tried to take away her reputation by this story of sex in the car. And I agree with Mrs. Dietrich. The easy out would have just been, I'm not going to fight. And she did fight. She had honor. You took that away from her. So we talked about how severe the crime is. We talked about the need to protect the public, why this is such a significant case, and we talked about the character of the defendant. So now, what is the appropriate sentence? It's a unique situation. You've been convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, Mr. Burch. It's automatically a life sentence. And then in Chapter 973, or in Statute 973.014, it gives the court options. Years ago, it used to be first-degree murder. And then after about 13 and a half years, there was automatic eligibility for parole, and the defendant could go before the parole board. Then the law was changed, and then it was changed again. Now we have our current law, where we call it first-degree intentional homicide. And the court has discretion. The parole eligibility date is 20 years, if the court chooses to do that, or it can set a parole eligibility date, or it can say, I can deny it entirely and say there's no parole. And the court has to use the sentencing factors to determine what is the appropriate parole eligibility date. Now, of course, parole eligibility date doesn't mean anyone ever gets out. Just, you say your parole eligibility date is 25, 30 years, you don't get out after 25, 30 years, you go before the parole board. Family has asked that the court sentence you to life without parole. The defense says 25 to 30 years, set a parole eligibility date. You know, when picking a parole eligibility date, how do you do that? Sometimes courts look at the age of the victim and then what the life expectancy is, and then you take the difference of that, and then you come up with your parole eligibility date. But I think the court's analysis is you look at the bottom line. What is an appropriate sentence here? You know, there's an old adage, the punishment must fit the crime. There's supposed to be mercy, but there's a saying we often use in court, mercy without justice dishonors everybody. The punishment has to fit the crime. And Ms. Dietrich, you don't have to apologize for having difficulty and forgiving. We're only human. There's only one person that can grant the kind of mercy that we hear about and talk about. Obviously, that's God, and only if somebody asks for it. So don't lose your faith. Don't let anybody lose their faith over what happened here, as difficult as that might be. But the punishment must fit the crime. And so what the court had thought of since that verdict is, what if this was a death penalty state? See, we haven't had the death penalty here since 1853. The maximum sentence, the most severe sentence, is life without parole. And putting my conflicted feelings about the death penalty aside, what if this was such a jurisdiction? Would this kind of crime, would this case, with these facts and this impact, justify a death penalty? Some people say, well, you use a death penalty if you have multiple victims, and others say, well, when the victim is a child. But this is a crime against a child. It's a crime against Mr. and Mrs. Vanderheiden's child. It's a crime against Nikki's children. It's severe, it's brutal, it's a crime against children. The answer is yes, Mr. Burch. This is a crime that would, I believe, merit the death penalty, and for that you have to die in prison. And Mr. Burch, I don't come to that decision quickly or lightly. I come to that decision by taking a step back and looking at the facts of this case and applying them to the galleon sentencing factors. So, you have to die in prison, Mr. Burch, and I could say 100 years or 200 years, or I could do what the family says and just order life without parole. They've suffered enough. I think that's commensurate with what this crime is all about. That will be the vehicle that the court will use to ensure that you spend the rest of your life in prison. The court does that because it's fair. That's the goal of every case that ever goes into court. You want a fair result, and that's fair here. In the confines of the system, I realize it's not really fair because you have life. And you took away Nicole's life. Your Tyler someday may want to talk to you, and you might have that chance. Nikki's Tyler can't. But within the confines and the parameters of the criminal justice system, it's most appropriate. Life without parole, to ensure that the punishment fits the crime. So, Mr. Burch, it's the order of this court, the sentence of this court, that you, George Burch, are sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Under Chapter 973.014, the court is exercising its discretion and will not set a parole eligibility date. Now, counsel, with that sentence of no parole eligibility date, the fact that Mr. Burch is not going to get out of prison, there's going to be no extended supervision. I think the court's not going to read the determinate sentencing rules. I think any conditions of extended supervision are ruled moot. And in terms of restitution, Attorney Saunders, what's the state's position?
We'd ask for 60 days.
All right. Well, I don't know if that can be derived out of funds that Mr. Burch may earn in prison, but I will add this as much because it was mentioned by, I think it was Mrs. Dietrich. Mr. Burch, you're not to profit at all from anything that might somehow come about because of this case. It's already gotten all kinds of national publicity. Write a book, have a movie, whatever. Any monies goes to the Dietrich and Vanderheiden families. Nobody profits because of this kind of brutality. But you have 60 days, Attorney Saunders, to provide whatever kind of restitution figure you want to present to the court. For the record, Mr. Burch is entitled to 605 days credit. Is there anything else for the record at this time, Attorney Kyle, from the defense?
No, thanks.
I'd ask if you go over your client's appeal rights. Is there anything else, Attorney Saunders? Okay, Mr. Burch, you have life. You can make something of your life in prison. That's your choice. To Vicki and the family, to the Dietrich family, prayers and support of this community are with you. Good luck and God bless. This court is in recess.
All right.